My name is Peter Hartley, and I'm the George A. Peterkin Professor of Economics in the Department of Economics at Rice University, and a Rice Scholar in Energy Studies with the James A. Baker the Third Institute for Public Policy here at Rice. Sorry, I just had my email ding and it upset me, confused me. I'll get out of the email. I'd like to welcome you all to our webinar this afternoon. I have with me Robert Idel, which I think I managed to mess his name up anyway. But even though I got lessons before we started, he's originally from Germany. But Robert's a PhD student in economics here at Rice University, being supported by the Center for Energy Studies. I'll let Robert say hello.
Good afternoon, everybody, or good evening to those listening from Europe.
Okay, thank you very much. I hope we do have some people from Europe. It's a very topical subject for them, I think. We also have with us, in fact, Raul Bajo Buenestado, and I'm sure I messed up his name as well, but he's the non-resident scholar at the Center for Energy Studies at the Baker Institute. And he's also an associate professor in the Department of Economics at the University of Navarra in Spain. And from our point of view too, another great part of his qualifications, he has his PhD from Rice. He's one of our former students supported by the Center for Energy Studies. So I'll let Rahul say hello.
Hi, good evening from Spain.
And again, thank you very much for joining us. This is the third of our series, Center for Energy Studies series of webinars featuring our graduate and postdoctoral young researchers. And we're very grateful for the Center for Energy Studies providing us with these webinar slots. In my position as Economics Department Professor, I'd also like to thank the Center for Energy Studies and its sponsors for supporting our PhD students who are engaged in energy research. And those students also do some teaching for us. In fact, they teach in the Master of Energy Economics program. And I might take just a few moments to advertise that program. It's quite distinctive as an energy economics program in that it really focuses on economic issues. We teach economics, financial and other analytical tools to professionals in the energy industry. So any of you in our audience who may be interested in doing our Masters of Energy Economics program, please check it out on the Department of Economics website. This webinar also is co-sponsored by the International Association for Energy Economics, which is the largest association of professionals specializing in the field of energy economics, and all three of us are members. The IEE publishes two professional journals, the Energy Journal and the Economics of Energy and Environmental Policy. They also publish a newsletter, hold conferences, and virtual presentations, along with providing a host of other products, energy database, and other services and so on that you can find at www.iaee.org. And for those of you in the Houston region, there's also a local Houston chapter that has met, and we hope can soon meet again for monthly meetings. The monthly meetings are held at the Houston branch of the Dallas Fed on Allen Parkway, and you can also check them out online. This webinar is being recorded and will be available at the Center for Energy Studies and the IAE websites. And please, if you want to ask a question, you can do so at any time. I'll be monitoring those and try to work them into our conversation if they're relevant. And if not, we will get to them at the end. You can use either the Q&A function or the chat function. I've got both up here to monitor. And we will get to your questions, hopefully, before we run out of time. With those preliminaries out of the way, I'm going to ask Robert first to tell us a bit, tell our audience what he's working on and how did he get interested in this particular topic in energy economics.
Yes, so thanks, Peter. One of the reasons why I quit my job in Munich and wanted to pursue a PhD is other challenges to mitigate the upcoming climate change. And if you look at the global greenhouse gas emissions, in this case in 2010, but it didn't really change much, you can see that electricity production, electricity generation is the major source of greenhouse gas emissions. In addition, my interest in economics are related to game theory and market design theory. So the topic of electricity markets, especially with the transition towards a renewable energy generation, is a perfect fit for me. And I get really nice inspiration from upcoming policies in Germany, and now Joe Biden just published a new report, a new proposal for his term in the White House. It's a very dynamic topic, a very dynamic field of research. So it's a perfect fit for me, and I'm really enjoying my research right now.
Okay, it's interesting. You're talking about greenhouse gas emissions. Of course, earlier in Europe, we had France and Sweden. The examples people point to with their nuclear programs, they had a dramatic reduction in CO2, by switching to a lot of nuclear. So why is there now such a strong interest, in wind and solar in Europe? You might think that the French and Sweden example might have made you more interested in nuclear.
Yeah, I mean, the nuclear is a big topic as well. So, but I would say that the discussions in Germany were dictated and triggered by the Fridays for Futures movement. So, Fridays for Futures, for those who don't know it, it's an activist movement by young people, started in the late 2018. And before Corona, young students, high school, mid-school students, didn't go to school on Fridays anymore to demonstrate for policies against the climate change.
This is like Greta.
Yeah, so it basically dictates the discussion in Germany, and one of the results coming out of it is the European Green Deal. Mm-hmm. And the European Green Deal was published in December 2019, basically states that Europe wants to reduce the net emissions to zero by 2050 and want to phase out in the electricity market. So the Green Deal has a special section for electricity markets and wants to phase out decarbonizing gas and coal. So what does it mean for Europe? So if we look at the electricity mix of Europe in 2018, 22%, so the largest share was nuclear, the second largest share was gas, the third largest share was coal. Mm-hmm. And gas here includes all types of gas, all types of gases. Then we got hydro, we got wind, and then biofuels and solar. So if we look at Germany, it looks, as Peter said, my home country, Germany, it looks slightly different, but a similar picture. So Germany has a large coal tradition, and most of the electricity still comes from coal. Wind is on place number 2, gas, nuclear, and so on. So going back to the Green Deal, what does it mean for Europe? Well, basically, phase out coal and decarbonizing gas. And then if we take the discussion for CCS a bit out of the picture, CCS would mean that you can burn gas and then store it, which is basically zero emission, a zero emitting source of electricity. If we take this out of the picture for the moment, basically means that Europe has to replace 39% of its generation capacity with other sources.
Just I have a question here, which you can work in at this point. Someone's asked, just to clarify, by Europe, you mean EU, really, in this?
I mean the European Union, and that was including Great Britain. So the numbers include Great Britain because in 2018, the European Union included Great Britain. So replacing 39% of your electricity mix is a challenge, especially if you have in mind that the electricity demand might also increase significantly due to EVs, due to electrification of transport.
Yeah, and heating.
However,
right? Electrification of heating too, because
as well, heating, transport,
yeah,
basically everything. If it gets electrified, which is still, it's still not clear in detail. But so that's already a gigantic challenge for the European Union. However, the Germans want to top this and are phasing out their nuclear power plants till, and that's the current plan, till the end of 2023. So Germany basically has to replace 55% of their electricity generation in the next 30 years with sources that cannot obviously include nuclear, and which basically mainly has to come from renewables.
So by 2050, they're going to be, if we ignore trade, Germany's going to be all renewables?
Yes, basically yes, depending on how biofuels and how you interpret the whole idea of biofuels and so on. But yeah, just renewables, which by itself wouldn't be a problem if Germany had favorable geography. So there are countries in the world that supply most of their electricity, that generate most of their electricity by renewable sources. For example, New Zealand is almost at 100%, Iceland, Paraguay, for example. But these countries have favorable geography by having base load renewable electricity, which is usually hydro, sometimes a bit of geothermal as well.
Yeah, Iceland is nearly all geothermal, really.
Iceland has like a mix. It's like geothermal and hydro,
yeah,
a bit as well. But so unfortunately, Germany doesn't have this. So the hydro capacities are almost exhausted. The geothermal is still under development. So basically, it comes down to wind and solar.
So what are some of the problems with trying to generate your electricity with wind and solar, and how are people thinking about handling that?
Yeah, so wind and solar, unfortunately, are intermittent and non-dispatchable. That means that they can't be scheduled, and they are varying over the time. I mean, for a gas plant can be scheduled, whereas a solar plant, humans can't schedule it. The entity that schedules the output of a solar plant is the sun.
Mm-hmm.
And the good news is, so this intermittency is a huge problem, especially because the demand is very inelastic. That means the demand can't react to the supply. And that means that, we need a constant supply of electricity. Mm-hmm. The good news here is that there is a solution to it, which is storage. And in this webinar, a little disclaimer, we're going to abstract a bit from the word storage. So in reality, in 30 years, we will see completely different, many different types of storage, depending on the function. So for example, a car will probably have a different type of storage in there than an industrial facility, because a car needs a high energy density. So the storage needs to be the weight matters and the density matters. Whereas for an industrial storage, the density doesn't really matter that much. The costs are more important. So we abstract here in this webinar from storage and just say storage is a way to store electricity. Mm-hmm. The issue with storage is that so far we haven't really figured out how to store electricity in an affordable way. It's too expensive. It's not sustainable so far. It uses resources that are harmful to the environment. So these are engineering issues related to storage, but also economical issues. For example, how to price electricity properly, how to price electricity from storage properly if storage becomes not a price taker anymore, but a price setter.
Okay. So actually, in the meantime, I had a question here about what % of that solar there is rooftop and what % is utility scale. Before we leave the picture.
I think a fair share of it is rooftop. I don't know. I don't know right now. I think it's a fair share is rooftop.
Yeah.
It's not just utility. There are some utility plans, but it's generated. Yeah.
So I'd like to bring Raul into the discussion. He's been waiting patiently there, so I'd like to bring him into this point. I mean, we had him in Texas here, and he left his heart in Texas. He continues to study the Texas electricity, at least the ERCOT market. But and he's interested in wind generation here in Texas. So has the penetration of wind in particular in Texas created similar problems to what they're dealing with in Europe? Raul.
Right. So when I was there in Texas, I got some interest in doing research on the Texas, because the reality there is not different from the reality that we see here in Europe, like what we see in the German market. In fact, wind generation capacity has been growing almost exponentially in the Texas ERCOT market over the last decade. Well, exponentially is maybe too generous, but is growing pretty impressively. So we see that generation capacity increased between 2015 from 13,000 megawatts until January 2019 to 22,000 megawatts, more or less. Most of these wind generation capacities was built like in North Texas, in the Panhandle, and also in West Texas. So unfortunately, not many. So what? Oh, can you hear me?
You froze a little bit there. I mean, yeah, keep going. It's fine.
Yes.
You might have to turn your video off if it freezes.
Okay. Turn the video off.
Maybe it might be a bit smooth.
Okay.
There we go.
So the point is, what is the key driver that explains this vast development of renewables? So in my opinion, is always all this development was driven by the federal wind production tax credit, which provides an upfront subsidy of $23 per megawatt hour. So if you have a wind you have a wind farm, you get $23 just to produce a megawatt hour of the federal government. Obviously, as we see additional wind capacity in Texas ERCOT, we see also that prices, the competitive pressure of renewables was decreasing over time, and because the marginal cost of wind is virtually zero, is also a problem for other types of generators in the system. Because if you see that most of the time you have zero prices in ERCOT, then it basically means that other resources are not making money at all. Therefore, we have observed that the reserve margin capacity in Texas has been decreasing. In fact, I have data from 2011, and back in 2011, the reserve capacity margin was expected to be less than 10% for the next decade. And you need to consider that the target for ERCOT is to have 10.75% of risk margin capacity. Okay, so the regulator thought about how to solve this problem, which is, I think we will talk about later a little bit about this, the missing money problem. So the fact that the generators are recovering enough money to invest in new capacity in the system.
Yeah. So
in Texas ERCOT, they wanted to remain as an energy-only market, which means they don't want to have a capacity market. So all the money that the generators get is through the wholesale market. Instead, Texas ERCOT implemented the ORDC, which is the Operating Reserve Demand Curve, and it's a different way to remunerate peak capacity in the system. This also brings an interesting what is exactly an energy-only market, because the moment the Texas ERCOT market implemented this ORDC, some people may think, okay, but it's not an energy market anymore because there's something else, like providing money to the generators, which is in this case the ORDC. In other systems is the capacity market itself. So for me, this is a very interesting debate. So the RDC is like a sort of capacity market, but it's also linked to the real-time market. So it's like it's like a non-delayed capacity market, which is linked to real-time operation.
Raul, maybe you're getting a little bit ahead here. I mean, I think maybe we'll come back to some of this discussion of the ORDC, but I'd like to sort of go back. I'd like to go back to Robert temporarily for a minute or two, and sort of. So we've got this idea. We've got renewables, and it does seem that they're creating various kinds of problems, engineering problems. In coping with the intermittency and the non-dispatchable character, And then maybe Raoul's just started to allude to the fact, and we're going to talk about this in more detail, but we want to get there, I think, that there does seem to be also a problem, it seems, in a lot of these cases where we've had a lot of renewables, in ensuring sufficient capacity, investment in generating capacity. And so, it's like we've got these electricity markets, but they aren't necessarily working. So, what's going wrong? I mean, why don't the markets work? And maybe I'll get Robert to sort of comment on that a little bit.
Yeah, so let's take a step back to also include the non-economists in this conversation. So the underlying problem here, and a fundamental question in economics, is how to allocate goods efficiently. And economists distinguish between how to allocate goods if you can use prices, and that's called auction theory, and if you can't use prices, and that's called matching theory. And in theory, the optimal solution to allocate goods is a central planner. A central planner that maximizes the welfare is the best way to maximize the welfare. Sadly, this doesn't work in practice for many reasons, because of the lack of information, the wrong incentives, and so on and so on. So the best feasible solution, the best solution, not the optimal, but the best we can get, are markets. And in markets, market participants act rationally, or if they act rationally, they maximize their outcomes. And by maximizing their outcomes, they can exploit opportunities or respond to opportunities. They have the right motivation. So markets is a fantastic idea. And the excitement goes all the way back to Adam Smith and the famous invisible hand, if you've heard of it. You probably heard of it, that even if everybody just maximizes their own utility function, the market outcome is to a certain degree efficient. However, that's a theory. And in practice, markets can fail badly, which we call market failure. So market failure, every time economists talk about market failure, they mean that the achieved outcome is not Pareto. They call it Pareto efficient, which means that there's a significant loss of economic value. And the big misunderstanding here is now that market failure is a sign that markets are bad. No, it's not a sign that markets are bad. It's just a sign that markets need more rules. Need a bit of steering, need to change the rules to avoid this market failure. And this whole work on changing the market rules to get rid of the market failure and to achieve the good outcome, because markets are the best thing we have in the end, are usually the best thing we have in the end. So this whole theory is market design. It's called market design theory. And that's where the field that I'm working in right now, and that's the field that these underlying discussions are based in.
Yeah. So that was really the idea behind the whole notion of reform toward electricity markets in the first place. I mean, I was involved in that way back in 1982. I'm not dating myself, but almost 40 years. At that time, electricity was supplied by state-owned, vertically integrated monopolies with regulated prices, we noticed at the time, that early 80s, that the IT revolution allowed for splitting the electricity industry into different, separating into generation, transmission, and distribution. Why would you want to do that? Basically, you want to introduce markets. So you got market signals, right, for generation, and then market signals for investment. And the prime motivation for introducing electricity markets really was to increase efficiency, like you're talking about on the generation side. But has it really worked out that way, Robert? Are there reasons to worry about efficient investment and production outcomes in electricity markets?
Yeah, so let's take a step back to just get the full picture of what electricity markets are about. So on the first glance, electricity markets trade only one product. So all over the world, electricity is basically electrons, flowing electrons, at a different frequency and so on. But in the end, it's just one product on the first glance. But the more you think about it, the more it becomes apparent that it's not just electrons. It's electrons at a time to a certain place. Mm-hmm. And especially this timing element is extremely important, Because in the end, it's not about generating electricity. If you generate electricity and you can't use it, it's worthless. Yeah. It's about providing a certain amount of electricity, which is quite inelastic in the short run, at a given time to a given place.
Right.
And that makes the cost evaluation extremely complex. The typical way of evaluating costs is that you have fixed costs and you have variable cost, and the average cost, which in electricity is called the levelized cost of electricity, is basically fixed cost plus variable costs times the output divided by the overall output. And in this type of, in this dimension, in this perspective, wind is extremely competitive. So a wind farm around Amarillo, which is one of the best places for a wind farm in the world, this wind farm is one of the cheapest ways to generate electricity.
On a levelized cost basis.
On a levelized cost, but to generate, just if you just want to generate electricity, it's one of the cheapest ways. Yeah. But you don't want to generate electricity in northern Amarillo. You want to provide the market in Dallas or in Houston at every given time with a certain amount of electricity. And that means that you don't only have to look at the cost of generating electricity in northern Amarillo, you have to include the cost of transportation, which isn't that of a big deal, and the cost of balancing, which is at least compared to the cost and compared to transportation, which is the large chunk of the added costs. And this is why, by the way, storage is also called the holy grail in electricity markets, because it turns a generator. It turns a generator into a provider, and a generator who uses intermittent sources, it turns this generator into a provider of electricity. Mm-hmm. But beyond the cost, and I think we can also fill a whole webinar just about ways to calculate cost of electricity. These markets have to fulfill two main coordination problems. The short one is to always dispatch the lowest cost first. That was what we call the efficient dispatch. Mm-hmm. And the long run is to provide sufficient investment incentives. And that's basically every market has in common that the prices should be high enough so that the suppliers make sufficient profit. Because if they don't make enough profit, if they lose from it, they stop the supply and then the market might break down. Currently, and I have to, I prepared some slides here. So currently, the markets are set up as follows. Mm-hmm. There we go. So currently, to generalize a bit here, the markets are set up as follows. We have a uniform, the price finding is as follows. Every hour, there's a bidding process, usually with a uniform second price sealed bid auction, and this determines the price. And as Raul already touched upon, there are many side markets and many other ways to generate price to generate profits, but the general concept is this auction mechanism. And this gives us a supply curve, because in a uniform second price sealed bid auction, the dominant strategy for every market participant is to bid their marginal costs. Vickrey got a Nobel Prize for showing this. So that makes it, from an economical, from the perspective of an economist, very nice to evaluate the market, because the bids reflect the marginal costs.
As long as people behave atomistically, of course.
Exactly, yeah, exactly. Unless there's collusion and so on. But in theory, the supply curve represents the marginal cost curve. Yeah. And if it really represents the marginal cost curve, the supply curve looks like this. And this is ERCOT data from 2010. And the following pictures all have the same marginal cost curve of production, which changed due to the low gas prices. So I think right now, natural gas combined cycle is cheaper than coal. But in 2010, the prices, coal was a bit cheaper. Mm-hmm. So it looks like this. And the efficient dispatch would be that wind is dispatched first and then nuclear and so on, which is basically, so if we have the demand side, depending on what the demand is, the price is either low if we have low demand periods and high if we have high demand periods. So in the old days, and I consider 2010 the old days, the supply curve was stable, was fixed, somehow fixed, and the price was determined by the demand. So if the demand was high, price was high, and so on. So what changes now? So as Raul already pointed out, the wind, and this is the data from 2020, so the wind capacity increased significantly, which is on the first glance good news, because wind has the lowest marginal costs, and if the costs decrease, the price should decrease. And on the first glance, you can see that here in this theory that the price becomes significantly lower, especially in high demand and low demand periods. So these are good news. One characteristic of renewables, very low prices.
The merit order effect, right?
Yeah, the merit order effect, very low prices.
Yeah.
The second characteristic of renewables, and that's the bad characteristic of renewables, is the intermittency. So in the old days, supply was fixed and the price was determined by the demand. In the new days, this 26.5 gigawatts of wind is the maximum.
Yeah.
And it's not this, we can't schedule it, and it changes. So basically, the wind capacity, the available wind capacity, can be anywhere between 0 and 26.5 gigawatts. For example, these days last year, Wednesday, July 17th and Monday, July 17th, both times at 5 p.m., the demand should have been somehow the same, because it was weekday at 5 p.m., the weather was similar, demand was similar. But the supply changed significantly. So there was a windy day on Wednesday, but there wasn't much wind on Monday. So with the new day, in the new days, with a high share of renewables, the market dynamics change significantly, because it's not just the demand dictates the price, but due to the intermittency, due to the volatility of the supply side, we have a disruption in the market mechanisms.
So we probably should move along here too, because we want to get to the I promised Raul we get back to the ORDC at some point. But before we do that, I mean, in your picture, prices are always positive, but I've looked at Texas prices and I've found that, you know, quite a lot of the time, more than 10% of the time, they're negative. So, you know, is there something wrong with the market here? And maybe I'll let Raul come in again, because you know, he's looked at this. So, and negative prices in Texas really a sign of market failure, or what's going
on? I don't think negative prices are a sign of failure. It's just, you know, a consequence of having inflexibility in the market. By inflexibility, what I mean? I mean that you have some generators, nuclear, that they have huge shutdown costs, so they are basically or generating 24/7. And on the other, you also have like I'm gonna turn off my video. I think it's better. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, so as I was saying, so on the one hand, you have the nuclear generators, which produce basically 24/7 because they have huge shutdown costs. On the other hand, you have wind generators, which they have they generate whenever the wind is blowing. A combination of nuclear wind at the time when the demand is very low, probably you're going to have a very low price in the system. Now, if you add the subsidy into this equation, then you have a subset of generators, in that case, the wind farms, that are with a negative price in the system. Suppose they bid like, I don't know, 20 per megawatt hour, then they receive positive 2 because or positive 3, because this is the difference between the price which is negative and the subsidy, which is $23 per megawatt hour from the federal government. So as I was saying, I don't think it's a necessary, I don't think it's a market failure. It's just the necessary consequence of having inflexible generation together with subsidies in the market.
But the subsidies, you know, I think are important because they're production subsidies, and so And a negative price has a problem, right? It means that, like the nuclear plant to generate, or any other gas plant, they're actually got to pay money to generate. So it's going to take money away from them. And that's what we call the missing money problem, isn't it? I mean, you want to tell us something about that?
Right, this is what I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation. So if you are another kind of if you own another plant in the system, suppose you own a coal plant or a gas plant, a gas turbine, and you see all of the sudden that prices not only are zero at many times, but they're negative in the night, probably your problem, because you're not going to recover the money that you need to build that. So this happens frequently, and this is probably the case if we have a lot of wind in the system. Then there is a problem for all gas turbines, for all these coal plants, because they don't recover the money and they don't have incentives to improve the plants and to build new ones. So at the end, they're gonna exit the market, and this is precisely the problem of the missing money problem, because you have a subset of generators not recovering the money that they invested, so they are not willing to invest again in this kind of technology.
Right. So is this going to be a problem in Europe, Robert? I'll go back to Robert, and under the Green Deal in particular, is a missing money problem. How that people are going to try and solve it?
Yeah. So the missing money problem with the new Green Deal, under a world where we have just where most of the electricity is provided by wind, solar, and storage, the missing money problem actually becomes much more severe. Because let's think it through. If the electricity is just provided by wind, solar, and storage, I calculated that most of the periods will have energy abundance, meaning that there's way more energy generated that can be stored or is used with the current technological conditions. So that means in these periods, the prices will be zero. If there's more demand, if there's more supply than demand, and the marginal costs are zero or almost zero, then the price will be almost zero. Mm-hmm. That means that, and these are like
just to interrupt a little bit. We had someone who asked this question. So how's the marginal cost of production going to influence price when it's all renewables? So this is exactly what you're going to explain, right? So I just make the point, the person who asked that question, here's the answer to that.
Perfect. So we anticipated upcoming questions.
Yeah.
So the price will be zero in these periods of electricity abundance. What does it mean then? So that means that storage can charge for free as well. If the market price is zero, you can charge your storage at a price of zero. But if you bought the stored electricity at a price of zero, and you don't have costs associated to releasing it, then you can also bid up to a price of zero on the market if storage is needed. And that means that the price will be zero in many, many periods, which is good news. It's fantastic news for consumers. If the price is zero, your electricity bill will be significantly lower. But
in the short run,
the issue is just, if you are a generator, would you invest in a market where the price is zero all the time, almost all of the time? No, and that's the missing money problem.
Right.
That right now I see is coming up, at least from a theoretical perspective, unless we redesign the market.
Mm-hmm. And so how can this problem with insufficient investment then be solved on the basis of your research?
So we have to redesign the market somehow. And this is my current research topic. So we have to find a pricing mechanism that ensures efficient dispatch and also gives enough incentives. And I'm currently looking at two types of pricing mechanisms. The one thing would be a pricing formula. That's an old idea, saying that you have certain market conditions, and then the price is not determined competitively, but with a pricing formula that says, okay, under these market conditions, that's the price. And this pricing formula has to be adjusted so that it's incentive compatible for the market participants. and so on. So it's difficult to design such a formula. But I'm currently looking at things that are already implemented, like operational reserve demand curves, as we have in Texas right now, where I say every time we need electricity from storage, the price goes up, depending on how much electricity we need from storage. So that's one type of market mechanisms I'm looking at. The second thing, my second idea was to just keep the auction mechanism and tweak it. Basically what we did the last 30 years. We implemented the auction mechanism, and every time there was a problem, we added another thing. And my idea was to reduce all the side payments, but give a certain amount of payment to storage owners who currently have stored electricity. Mm-hmm. What does it mean? If you only get money for storing electricity, for doing nothing, that gives a cost for releasing it. So if you get money for not doing anything, you suddenly have a cost for doing something. These are the two different types. So the pricing formula on the one hand, and the add-on to the auction pricing on the other hand.
So again, there's another question here. I mean, that someone's asked, and which we can kind of, I think, address, which is, does this missing money problem mean that deregulation doesn't work? I guess what you're saying is maybe what we need to do is supplement
exactly
the market with a different kind of mechanism to get the right kind of signals we want to solve both of these problems, both the dispatch problem and the investment problem, right? You're proposing these. You've got these two alternatives. Maybe at this point, I might get back to Raul again and ask. I mean, I cut you off about the ORDC before, so Robert's got these pricing mechanisms. I mean, Texas, we've supplemented, the energy market with this ORDC. And by the way, along the way, maybe you could comment. I've had other questions here, people talking about ancillary services. I mean, that's another way, that you can have, like in the the NEM market in Australia, they have a market for ancillary services, and that's meant to provide money for peaking plant and so forth, which will cover investment as well. So, I mean, how are all these ideas related? You've got, and the other thing we haven't talked about is capacity markets. I mean, some systems have capacity markets. So we got these different proposals. What's your comment on how these are kind of related to each other? Raul maybe first, and maybe Robert too.
So, well, there are too many things on the table right now. So
I picked it.
Yeah, I want to mention that by no means. I mean, someone said that the deregulation hasn't worked.
Yeah, because of the missing money problem. Yeah,
obviously there was deregulation in many industries. Let's take, for instance, in the airlines industry. But still, these days you have regulation in some goods. Doesn't mean that the regulation didn't work. Simply that some.
They're talking about specifically with electricity.
Sometimes.
Because of the electricity market, we don't. We've got this missing money problem.
Right. But my point here is that you have very similar issue here. So you have a missing market in the electricity market at the moment. You have a coordination failure, which because each generator is not willing by itself to provide this precautionary extra capacity. Almost also considering that the short-run marginal cost is almost equal to zero. So if there is no, cost recovery, obviously you're not going to have any incentives. Invest also in this precautionary extra capacity just in case there is a peak in the demand. Then the regulator to coordinate everyone and to agree everyone. Okay, so we need to deliver, or we need the system must guarantee to have this much capacity just in case there is a peak in the demand. Mm-hmm. Okay, so then you have the capacity market to reach capacity in the system.
Sorry, you cut out a bit there, Raul. So
okay, now okay. So I was saying that the regulator is the coordinator that guarantees that the amount of capacity necessary to meet peak demand is in the system.
Yeah.
Different story is the ORDC, because the ORDC is the real-time market. So is the I'm saying this might be maybe I brought this issue early in the conversation. I get passionate about the ORDC. For me, the ORDC is like a non-delayed market, because here, obviously, in Texas, they don't talk about capacity; they talk about reserves. But it's just a matter of time. So we talk about capacity 3 years ago, and we talk about reserve now, as the real-time market clears. So, but again, it's just another mechanism to provide additional, additional payments, if you wish, to the generators in the system. And to avoid this missing money problem, or to mitigate this missing money problem.
So yeah, we've had one question here who claims, that it's not really deregulation that's the problem. It's the problem that we've continued to regulate it, in particular pushing intermittent sources into the system. That's the problem. But I suppose that gets all back to the premise of this discussion was that we're going to move toward a system where we got a lot of this renewable anyway, and then the question is, how do we accommodate it, right? I mean, I guess there's a prior question as to whether this was a smart thing to do, and there've been a number of questions about environmental, whether this is the right way to approach these issues and so on. But we've sort of left those things to one side. I mean, the whole point here was to say that if we are going to have a lot of renewables, how do we handle them, and what kind of pricing mechanism do we use to handle the implication of that? Whether that was a smart thing to do or not is not, wasn't really our discussion here. It was just, we've got this implication, right? And it's happening. It's happening that the renewables are coming, and so we've got to have some way of handling it. Maybe you go back to Robert and say a little bit about, how do you compare these different ways of pricing from your perspective?
Yeah, so first I define when is a pricing method optimal, and how do you optimize pricing methods? And my measure here was that I want to minimize consumers' costs, conditional on providing sufficient incentives to the generators. And what I do is a so-called Monte Carlo analysis. So I simulate market conditions every year. So I simulate 8,760 hours per year in a different in a certain market. I simulate the weather, and I simulate the wind and solar intensity, and I simulate the demand. And for every year I solve for the optimal installed capacity, meaning given these market conditions, what would the cost minimizing installed capacity be? Then I optimize each pricing mechanism given on this 1 year, and calculate the costs for the next 20 years. So optimize on 1 year, calculate the cost, fit it on 1 year, calculate the cost of another of the next 20 years. And then I do this exercise. I estimate, so far I simulated 2,000 years. So, and then I compare
2,000 years.
2,000 years, yeah. 2,000 times 8,760. I'm really glad that that the PhD student who was in my office before me somehow negotiated to get a lot of RAM on his computer, and I inherited the computer, so it was a bit of effort. And what I found so far is that the storage pricing, so the add-on to the auction mechanism, works significantly better than any formula I've looked at so far, and leads to meaning that it leads to a lower cost, and it's easier to fit.
The storage price.
Storage. So paying storage, paying storage to not do anything.
Yeah, well, you're paying them to store.
To keep it, which has a really interesting economic application, because there will be, and this comes back to ancillary services and reserve capacity, in a market where storage is an important part of the market, there will be storage capacity that should not be used at all, or rather not be used at all as a backup. And how do you price this? Because you have stored in the end, it's some sort of insurance. It's very related to the reserve capacity that you might need. You hope you don't need it, but how do you price something that you hope you don't need but might need at some point? How do you incentivize How do you incentivize this? Paying for it. How do you incentivize installing it? And one way is to specifically give subsidies, give payments to these storage owners. And the other way is to somehow find a market mechanism that a pricing mechanism that includes payment to these facilities.
So you've also kind of done research on this, haven't you, Raul? I mean, you've sort of thought about this ORDC or some of these things is sort of like an insurance market.
Correct. So for me, precisely a capacity market is like an insurance market. An insurance that guarantees that there is, as I said before, enough capacity in the system. So every one of us is paying, well, in the case everyone is in a market in which there is a capacity market, every customer in the system is paying a little bit just to have extra precautionary capacity. Now, the problem is the ORDC, is this providing the right incentives to have this extra precautionary capacity in the system? Well, it seems so far it wasn't providing the right incentives. And if we check back the data in 2018, we see that the reserve margin was really tight in the system. It was actually below the 13.75% of target reserve margin capacity target in ERCOT. So there is something going on that the ORDC is not providing this. And that is why also we need to consider that in March 2019, I think you lost me again a bit. Okay, no, in March 2019, the regulator shifted the ORDC curve right a little bit, and also in March 2020. So they're not so sure that this ORDC is working well, and this is my take. So this is because as wind is increasing in the system, you have additional hours with prices or the prices equal to zero. So basically, this mechanism is providing no additional incentives for future generation or current generators in the system.
Right. I've had a question here, a technical question for you, Robert. And when you talk about this 2,000 years, my understanding is you just had lots of years. It's not literally you're thinking of a system going 2,000 years. You're just wanting to have the possibility for different kinds of weather conditions, right? So
exactly.
That's really the idea.
Yeah, I just use standard econometric like estimation techniques.
Right. It's not. Someone said, this is crazy thinking about 2,000 years.
Yeah. No, I completely understand. No, so I don't see myself having enough authority to make any assumptions about weather consequences. So I just use standard. So I just wanted 20 years that are somehow similar to what could happen.
Right. So that's the whole point of the Monte Carlo. You want to allow for all sorts of different possibilities.
Exactly. So, and I'm actually quite certain that the reality will be included in one of the years that I'm looking at. But yeah.
So another idea that's kind of in the couple of the questions here, but it's something that I've heard other people talk about too, which is, if the intermittent sources of generation are creating these problems, we need to take extra steps to always ensure that supply equals demand, the system's balanced and so forth. It's kind of like an externality imposed by the intermittent sources. I mean, some people have said, well, what we should do is require the intermittent sources to bring their own backup. And so then, another way of paying for the storage or whatever would be that you've got to bid in firm capacity, right? And so the wind farms would have to contract their own, could be storage or whatever. Have you sort of thought about that, or either of you kind of looked at that kind of system where the wind farms themselves contract for the backup?
On a first glance, that would mean that it basically favors large investors, because the more wind farms, the more solar farms you have, and also the more conventional sources of electricity you have, the easier it is for you to balance. If you only have one wind farm at one place, it's much more expensive for you to balance your output. But that could, if this is required, that could put a a giant question mark behind the development towards renewable sources, because renewables benefit right now from not having this burden of caring about balancing the output.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So other people have asked questions. Another couple of things that have come up in a few questions is the idea of how how all this fits in with trade. And you've not really talked about trade in electricity, and particularly if you think about Germany, right? I mean, you can trade with neighbours and so on. So there's that issue. And then the other thing that's come up, which maybe either of you or both of you could comment on, is having demand more responsive to prices. There's another way of providing, balancing the system, if you like. And then and the third thing is energy efficiency. Might that impact and the whole development of the electricity system? So trade in electricity, maybe the first one there.
How about I give the trade question to Raul and start with the demand side and energy efficiency. So I think the best way to increase energy efficiency and to increase demand response is by setting the prices properly. And with probably, I mean high enough at the right times. And energy efficiency is mostly driven by high prices. And you can see it by yourself. If your electricity bill, you don't think about insulation if you only pay like $50 a month on air conditioning. But as soon as you pay $500 a month on air conditioning, you start going through your house and trying to make your house more energy efficient. Mm-hmm. So efficiency is driven by prices. And so what's important is to make the prices, to set the right prices. Mm-hmm. And demand response, it's similar. It's similar. So if the price, especially the consumer's price, varies according to the supply price, you encourage the right demand response. For example, an electricity plant that you can buy right now, at least in Houston, is to not pay electricity at night, only during the day, which basically corresponds to the fact that usually there's more wind at night than during the day, and the peak demand during the day is at 6 p.m. So the energy companies want to move your air conditioning air conditioning time or your electricity usage from the day to the night. Mm-hmm.
Before I let you off the hook, though, Robert, I mean the question about trade, you sort of flicked that off to Raul, which I'll get his comments in a moment. But your model, you don't allow for trade. So how would it affect your calculations?
So trade basically is a way to flatten the intermittency to a certain degree. So it's a way to flatten the intermittency. It makes, if there is sufficient interconnection, and if all the countries in the trade market follow the same standards, the same pricing mechanisms, it benefits the cause, and it benefits the renewable sources, especially wind, because it's a way to flatten the intensity.
Mm-hmm. And Raul, do you have any comments on any of those questions?
A couple of comments on trade. First, I wonder if this question was brought by an European person, because this is not relevant in Texas, because Texas is isolated. However, this is a big deal here in Europe, because there are some countries developing capacity markets, some other countries not developing capacity markets. So in some sense, if you have trade between two countries, one has capacity market, has not, then probably the country that has not is free riding the extra capacity of them. So this is a huge topic right now of discussion here in. And also you have the point of demand response. I don't know if we have time to demand response.
Yeah, just go ahead.
But very briefly, response so far in Texas is not very well. But I know that I think in PJM you have the possibility of bidding also in the capacity market. Demand response is able to bid into the system. So probably it's a matter of time to do this also in Texas. But
in the Australian market, you can have demand side flexibility bidding into the ancillary services market. So
Okay.
as well. I guess we're starting to run out of time, or we've more or less run out of time. Just last question to both of you is, a couple of people have asked, your paper is going to be available for download, and so you can advertise where your papers may be available. So.
Yeah. So I mean, it's not ready yet. But if you have any questions, and if you want to read my paper, and if you want to talk with me about it, please reach out to me. Robert.m.idel@rice.edu. Because I'm really interested in hearing from the participants. So please reach out to me.
And Raul?
Yeah, I think some of my papers are in the Baker Institute website.
Yes.
And some other are, I think all of them are in the website. So yes,
okay.
If you're interested, just also check my website, and I have all the stuff also in the Baker Institute website.
Okay, I think at this point we probably should cut off because my clock says 1:01, so we've gone a minute over. So I'd like to thank the audience very much for their questions. I'm sorry, I don't know I got to all of them. We tried to work them in as we went through as much as possible. But your profile, yes, okay, so I just got a message saying your profile is available on the website as well.
Yeah, in case you have any questions.
At this point, I guess we'll sign off. Thank you very much for coming to this again, and we look forward to seeing you at the next CES webinar. Thank you very much.
Thank you, and have a good week.
Thank you.